The Legend of the Montana Hermit. The month was April, and the year was 1996. In the dense wilderness of Montana, where winter had not yet surrendered and a thick blanket of snow covered the landscape, there was a place where time seemed to have stopped. 5 miles outside the tiny town of Lincoln, deep within the shadows of the Rocky Mountains, stood a weathered wooden shack. It was so small it could hardly be called a home, just a 10 by 12-foot structure of rough-hewn timber. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of wood smoke, sulfur, and the musty smell of old paper. There was no sign of electricity. In the flickering light of a single candle, a man sat hunched over, scratching words onto a page. Outside, the only sound was the distant, lonely howl of a wolf. For 25 years, this had been the sanctuary of Theodore J. Kaczynski. To the few locals in Lincoln, he was known only as Teddy, a thin, ragged man who rode a rusty bicycle to the library, grew his own potatoes, and hunted small game. No one in their wildest dreams imagined that this seemingly harmless hermit had spent the last 17 years holding the entire United States in a grip of terror. 17 long years. That is how long the FBI had spent chasing a shadow. They called the investigation UNABOM, short for University and Airline Bomber. It was the most expensive and frustrating manhunt in the history of the Bureau. Thousands of agents had worked day and night, pursuing every lead, yet they had never even come close to their target. To the FBI, the bomber was an evil genius who always remained 2 steps ahead of the law. But on April 3, 1996, that long wait was about to end. The FBI had quietly surrounded the perimeter. They were terrified. They feared that Kaczynski had booby-trapped his cabin with high-grade explosives. Instead of a violent raid, they chose a psychological trick. 3 agents disguised as forest rangers approached the cabin and knocked. They used a ruse, telling him they needed his help with a property line survey. The door creaked open with a slow, chilling groan, and a hand reached out, a hand stained by chemical burns and trembling with age. Within seconds, America's most wanted man was pinned to the dirt. As the agents stepped inside the cabin, the sight before them made their blood run cold. This was not just a residence, it was a museum of terror. In that tiny 10 by 12-foot space, every inch was utilized with the cold precision of a mathematician. More than 200 books lined the walls, with scientific journals and ancient philosophy sitting side by side. There were jars of chemicals labeled in cryptic codes. Scraps of copper pipe and wooden boxes were scattered everywhere. Most shockingly, Kaczynski had never used commercial parts for his bombs. He crafted his own screws, carved his own wooden switches, and even made his own glue from melted deer hooves, ensuring that nothing he used could ever be traced back to a store. Underneath a simple cot, they found a fully constructed bomb, wrapped in brown paper and ready to be mailed the very next day. If the FBI had been 24 hours late, another innocent life would have been lost. When the agents looked at Ted, they saw a man who looked like a ghost from another century. His hair was a wild mane of filth, his clothes were literally rotting off his body, and he carried the sharp, biting scent of raw chemicals. But the question that haunted everyone was simple. How did a man who was once a brilliant mathematics professor at one of California's elite universities become a cold-blooded killer living in a hole in the woods? To find the answer, we must leave the mountains of Montana and travel back to Chicago in 1942. Ted Kaczynski was not born a criminal. He was a miracle child, with an IQ of 168, higher than that of Stephen Hawking. His family was intensely proud of him. He was a sensitive, respectful boy who loved classical music and the peace of nature. But he was different. While other children played outside, he solved complex mathematical equations. By the age of 16, when most are just finishing high school, Ted was already walking the halls of Harvard University. It was here, in the prestigious, hallowed halls of Harvard, that the foundations of the UNABOM were laid. This was the moment Ted's path crossed with a man named Dr. Henry Murray. And it was here that the United States government began a secret experiment that would shatter Ted Kaczynski's mind forever. The breaking of a mind. In the fall of 1958, 16-year-old Ted Kaczynski arrived at Harvard University. He was a boy among men, a working-class kid from the suburbs of Chicago thrust into the elite world of the American Ivy League. While his peers were obsessed with social status and the burgeoning culture of the 1950s, Ted was a ghost in the hallways. He was younger, smaller, and vastly more intelligent than almost everyone he met. But beneath that brilliance, a profound sense of alienation was beginning to rot. He felt like a fish out of water, mocked by faculty and students alike for his shabby clothes and his blue-collar roots. It was during this period of deep isolation that Ted caught the eye of a man who would change the trajectory of his life forever, Dr. Henry Murray. To the students at Harvard, Murray was a titan of social science, a famous psychologist with a research center named in his honor. But Murray had a secret. He was a consultant for the newly formed CIA, and he was looking for human guinea pigs for a project designed to understand the limits of the human psyche. The experiment was simple in its setup, but devastating in its execution. Ted and 21 other students were asked to write a detailed essay about their most deeply held personal beliefs and life philosophies. They were told these essays would be used for a friendly debate with a fellow student. Ted, already struggling with depression and a bleak outlook on the world, poured his soul into his writing. His essay was noted by Murray's team as the most pessimistic and vulnerable of the entire group. Then, the trap was sprung. Ted was led into a room with bright, blinding lights and strapped to electrodes that monitored his heart rate and respiration. Instead of a friendly debate, he was confronted by a trained legal interrogator whose only job was to humiliate him. 4 hours, the interrogator systematically tore apart Ted's beliefs, mocking his intelligence, his family, and his very sense of self. It wasn't a debate, it was a psychological assault. This wasn't a one-time event. For 3 long years, Ted was subjected to these abusive stress tests. He was forced to watch filmed recordings of his own humiliation over and over again. Murray wanted to see how much it took to break an educated man. While other students in the study walked away with varying degrees of trauma, Ted's reaction was the most extreme. His heart rate skyrocketed, his anger boiled over, and his distrust of authority curdled into a cold, hard hatred. Unbeknownst to Ted, he had become a pawn in MK-Ultra, a top-secret CIA program exploring mind control and behavioral modification. The military wanted to know if they could use psychological pressure to break an enemy's will. Many historians and psychologists now believe that these experiments didn't just study Ted's personality, they fractured it. The sensitive, respectful boy who entered Harvard began to disappear, replaced by a man who saw the world as a system of control that needed to be destroyed. By the time Ted graduated and moved on to the University of Michigan to earn his Ph.D., the transformation was nearly complete. He was a mathematical genius, solving problems that had baffled professors for years, but his soul was darkened by a singular obsession. He began to see technology and modern society as the ultimate interrogator, a system that stripped humans of their freedom just as Dr. Murray had stripped him of his dignity in that brightly lit room. In 1967, Ted became the youngest assistant professor in the history of UC Berkeley. He had reached the pinnacle of academic success. But the ghost of Harvard followed him. He looked at his students, the future engineers and scientists of the world, and he didn't see scholars. He saw the technician class, the people who would build the very machines that would eventually enslave humanity. One day, without warning and without a word to his family, Ted Kaczynski walked into his chairman's office and resigned. The academic world was stunned. He was walking away from a brilliant career, but in Ted's mind, he wasn't quitting. He was going to war. The engineering of death. In the summer of 1971, the brilliant career of Dr. Theodore Kaczynski officially died. He traveled to the remote outskirts of Lincoln, Montana, with his brother David. Together, they purchased a small plot of land and built a simple, one-room cabin. At first, it seemed like a pursuit of the American dream of self-reliance. Ted wanted to live like a pioneer, hunting his own food, gathering wild berries, and sleeping by the warmth of a wood-burning stove. He wanted to prove that a human being could exist entirely outside the technological system he had grown to despise. But the peace he sought was an illusion. As the years passed, the modern world began to infringe on his sanctuary. New roads were paved through his quiet woods. The roar of chainsaws from logging companies drowned out the sounds of nature. Low-flying jets screamed across the sky. To Ted, these weren't just annoyances, they were personal attacks. He saw the technician class, the engineers, the scientists, and the corporate executives, as a virus consuming the planet. His journals from this era reveal a terrifying shift. The frustration of a lonely hermit began to crystallize into the cold calculations of a killer. He didn't just want to hide from the world anymore. He wanted to strike back at the heart of the machine. But Ted faced a problem. He was a mathematician, not an engineer. He had never built a weapon in his life. Inside that cramped, dark cabin, Ted began a self-taught course in the chemistry of death. He was meticulously careful. Because he lived off the grid, he knew that buying specialized parts from a hardware store would create a paper trail. So, he decided to build everything from scratch. He used scraps of copper piping found in junkyards. He carved intricate wooden trigger mechanisms with the precision of a watchmaker. He even avoided using commercial match heads, instead laboriously grinding his own explosive powders from raw chemicals. His first attempt in May 1978 was a crude wooden box left in a parking lot at Northwestern University. When a security guard opened it, the device detonated, causing minor injuries. For most criminals, this would be a failure. For Ted, it was a successful test run. He began to keep detailed logs of his experiments, noting which chemical mixtures produced the most heat and which casing designs created the most lethal shrapnel. He was debugging his bombs like a computer programmer would debug code. By 1979, he moved from university campuses to his next target, the airline industry. He managed to sneak a bomb into the cargo hold of American Airlines Flight 444. His goal was to bring the entire plane down, killing everyone on board. Only a faulty timing mechanism prevented a catastrophe. The bomb began to smoke and hiss, forcing an emergency landing, but it failed to detonate fully. The FBI was horrified. They realized they weren't dealing with a common arsonist. They were dealing with someone who possessed a high-level understanding of physics and a total lack of empathy. The FBI gave the case the code name UNABOM, and the hunt began. But Ted was a ghost. He lived in a town where no one suspected him. He had no car, no phone, and no digital footprint. He would take long bus trips across the country to mail his packages from different cities, wearing disguises like wigs and fake mustaches to blend into the crowds. While the FBI spent millions of dollars analyzing the metal fragments of his bombs, Ted sat in his cabin, reading history books by candlelight and perfecting his next masterpiece of destruction. He was no longer just a man. He was the Freedom Club, a one-man revolutionary army determined to bring the industrial world to its knees. The 17-year shadow. By the mid-1980s, the Unabomber was no longer just an anonymous threat. He had become a national nightmare. His craftsmanship had evolved from crude wooden boxes to sophisticated, lethal devices that baffled the greatest explosive experts in the world. He began to use double-trap triggers, mechanisms designed to explode the moment a lid was lifted or a string was pulled. He was no longer just testing his theories. He was hunting. In December 1985, the game turned deadly. Hugh Scruton, a 38-year-old computer store owner in Sacramento, California, spotted a wooden box in the parking lot behind his business. Thinking it was litter or a lost package, he reached down to move it. The explosion was massive, filled with handmade steel shrapnel that killed him instantly. In his cabin in Montana, Ted Kaczynski read the news of Scruton's death. He didn't feel guilt. In his journals, he noted the success of the experiment with the cold detachment of a laboratory scientist. To Ted, Scruton wasn't a man with a family. He was a representative of the technological system that needed to be dismantled. The FBI was paralyzed. They had formed the UNABOM Task Force, a massive operation involving the FBI, the ATF, and the Postal Inspection Service. They analyzed every scrap of metal, every grain of powder, and every sliver of wood. They noticed a strange detail. Many of the bombs contained the letters FC stamped into the metal. They speculated it stood for Freedom Club, but they had no idea who or how many people belonged to it. They profiled the killer as a blue-collar worker, perhaps a disgruntled aircraft mechanic or a lab technician. They never suspected that their target was a former Harvard prodigy living in a shack without a toilet. Then, in 1987, the FBI finally got the break they had been praying for. In Salt Lake City, a witness looking out a window spotted a man in a gray hooded sweatshirt and aviator sunglasses placing a white plastic bag in a parking lot. This witness provided the description for what would become the most famous police sketch in history: the hooded figure with a mustache and the hidden eyes. When the sketch was released nationwide, the bombings suddenly stopped. For 6 long years, the Unabomber went silent. The FBI thought he might have died, been arrested for another crime, or simply lost his nerve. But in reality, Ted Kaczynski was just being patient. He was watching the world change. He watched as the first personal computers began to enter every home, as the internet began to weave its web around society, and as humans became more dependent on the machines he hated. Inside his cabin, the silence wasn't a sign of peace, it was a period of refinement. He was spending those 6 years writing. He realized that bombs alone wouldn't start a revolution. He needed an ideology. He began drafting a massive, 35,000-word treatise titled Industrial Society and Its Future. He decided that his next wave of bombs would be so powerful and his targets so prominent that the world would have no choice but to stop and listen to his message. In 1993, the silence broke with a vengeance. 2 bombs exploded within 48 hours of each other, severely injuring a world-renowned geneticist and a leading computer scientist. The UNABOM was back, and this time, he was deadlier and more vocal than ever. He began sending letters to the New York Times, making a chilling ultimatum: publish my manifesto, or the bodies will keep piling up. The FBI was faced with an impossible choice: negotiate with a terrorist, or let the nation live in permanent fear of the mail. The ultimate ultimatum. By 1995, the UNABOM had moved from being a serial killer to a political terrorist with a global platform. He was no longer hiding in total silence. He began a sophisticated cat-and-mouse game with the American media, sending long, typewritten letters to the New York Times and the Washington Post. His demand was unprecedented in the history of FBI investigations. He would permanently desist from terrorist activities if, and only if, the newspapers published his 35,000-word manifesto, titled Industrial Society and Its Future. This demand ignited a firestorm of ethical debate within the highest levels of the U.S. government. Attorney General Janet Reno and FBI Director Louis Freeh were pulled into secret meetings with the publishers of the nation's top newspapers. The dilemma was agonizing. On one hand, the FBI had a strict policy: we do not negotiate with terrorists. Publishing the manifesto would be seen as a massive victory for the bomber, proving that violence could buy a front-page voice. It could inspire copycats and validate his bloody crusade. On the other hand, the FBI was desperate. 17 years of investigation had yielded nothing but a mountain of scrap metal and a grainy sketch of a man in a hoodie. The Bureau believed that the UNABOM was telling the truth, that if they published his words, he would stop the killings. More importantly, they hoped that by putting his unique writing style, his specific grievances, and his peculiar vocabulary in front of millions of people, someone, somewhere, would recognize the voice of the killer. After months of deliberation, the decision was made. In September 1995, the Washington Post published the manifesto as a special pull-out supplement. Across America, millions of people sat at their breakfast tables, reading the opening line that would become hauntingly famous: "The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race." The public was fascinated and horrified. The manifesto wasn't the rambling of a madman. It was a deeply intellectual, albeit radical, critique of modern life. It spoke of the loss of human freedom, the psychological suffering caused by technology, and the destruction of the natural world. It was a mirror held up to a society that was becoming increasingly addicted to the very machines the bomber hated. While the public debated the ideas, the FBI waited by the phones, hoping for the one tip that would lead them to the man behind the words. They didn't know that 3,000 miles away, in a quiet home in New York, a woman named Linda Patrick was reading those same words and feeling a cold pit form in her stomach. This is Part 5, Chapter 2, The Betrayal of Blood. It explores the domestic detective work of Linda Patrick and the moral agony of Ted's brother, David Kaczynski. Part 5, Chapter 2, The Betrayal of Blood. While the FBI waited for a tip from a disgruntled neighbor or a forensic lead, the real breakthrough was happening in a quiet home in Schenectady, New York. Linda Patrick, a philosophy professor, had never met her brother-in-law, Ted. She only knew him through the stories her husband, David, told, stories of a brilliant, sensitive older brother who had abandoned a promising math career to live in a shack in Montana. But Linda had a nagging suspicion. She had followed the news of the UNABOM for years, and the timing of Ted's rare trips away from his cabin seemed to align perfectly with the dates of the bombings. When the Washington Post finally published the 35,000-word manifesto, Linda sat down to read it with a sense of dread. As she turned the pages, she didn't just see a political argument. She saw the shadow of the man David had described. The obsession with the technician class, the hatred of industrial progress, and the specific, repetitive phrasing felt eerily familiar. She turned to David and said the words he had been terrified to hear: "I think your brother is the UNABOM." David Kaczynski was devastated. He loved Ted. They had grown up as best friends, sharing a love for the outdoors and intellectual debate. He remembered Ted as the boy who cried when he saw an animal in pain. David himself shared many of Ted's anti-technology views. He, too, had lived off the grid for a time. He couldn't believe that the brother he looked up to, the man who sent him long, thoughtful letters about nature and philosophy, could be a cold-blooded killer. But Linda insisted. She pushed David to compare the manifesto to the old letters Ted had sent him over the years. David pulled several dusty boxes from storage and began a side-by-side analysis. It was a slow, agonizing realization. He found a 1971 essay Ted had written that contained the exact same phrases used in the 1995 manifesto. He recognized Ted's peculiar habit of using the expression cool-headed logician and his specific way of criticizing leftism. The voice in the newspaper wasn't just similar to Ted's, it was Ted's. For weeks, David was trapped in a moral purgatory. If he stayed silent, more people would die. If he spoke up, he would be sending his own brother to the leather chair of the execution chamber. He spent nights walking the streets, haunted by the faces of the victims he saw on the news. Finally, with Linda's support, David made the most difficult decision of his life. He contacted a private investigator who acted as a bridge to the FBI. David's only condition was anonymity and a plea for mercy. He wanted the FBI to promise they wouldn't seek the death penalty, arguing that Ted was mentally ill. The FBI, however, made no such promises. They took the letters David provided and handed them to their top linguistic experts. The match was nearly 100%. After 17 years of chasing a ghost, the FBI finally had a name: Theodore John Kaczynski. The trap was ready to be set, but the man in the cabin still had no idea that his own blood had turned him in. The Siege of Lincoln. By late March 1996, the sleepy town of Lincoln, Montana, had become the secret center of the American intelligence world. The FBI had set up a command post in a nearby hotel, and undercover agents were crawling through the snowy brush surrounding Ted Kaczynski's property. They had a name, they had the letters from his brother, and they had a location. But they still lacked a smoking gun, physical evidence that linked the man in the shack to the shrapnel in the mail. The tension within the FBI was at a breaking point. They were terrified that Kaczynski, with his genius-level intellect, might have sensed the surveillance. If he realized the net was closing, they feared he would trigger a final solution, a massive explosion that would destroy himself, his cabin, and any evidence of his 17-year reign of terror. Every agent involved was ordered to move with total silence. No sirens, no helicopters, no flashy displays of force. On the morning of April 3, 1996, the endgame began. The FBI decided not to kick down the door. They knew Ted was paranoid of authority, but they also knew he was curious. They sent 3 agents to his door, dressed in the rugged clothes of local forest rangers. They knocked and called out, "Ted? We're with the Forest Service. We've got a problem with a property line survey, and we need your help." Inside the cabin, Ted Kaczynski was busy. He was in the middle of a dirty job, grinding down aluminum blocks into fine powder to create the explosive heart of a new bomb. He was covered from head to toe in metallic dust, his hair matted, his clothes literally rotting off his frame. He heard the knock. For 25 years, he had been the one watching the world, but in that moment, the world had come for him. He opened the door just a few inches, squinting into the bright Montana sun. As he reached out to take a map from the ranger, an agent grabbed his arm and yanked him forward. In an instant, the hermit of Lincoln was slammed into the dirt. Heavily armed tactical teams swarmed out of the trees, their weapons trained on the tiny wooden shack. The most expensive manhunt in history was over, but the true horror was only just beginning to be revealed. As the bomb technicians gingerly stepped inside the 10 by 12-foot space, they realized they were standing in a masterclass of lethal engineering. It wasn't just a home, it was a factory. They found thousands of pages of journals written in a complex, multi-layered code, a cipher so difficult that even the FBI's top codebreakers would take months to unravel it. These journals contained the smoking gun, detailed, step-by-step confessions for every single bombing since 1978. But the most chilling discovery was found tucked neatly underneath Ted's simple wooden cot. Wrapped in a plain brown grocery bag, addressed and ready for the mail, was a fully functional live bomb. It was a masterpiece of handcrafted violence, destined for an aerospace executive in Dallas. If David Kaczynski had waited even 24 hours longer to call the FBI, another name would have been added to the list of the dead. The man the world saw being led away in handcuffs, filthy, emaciated, and wild-eyed, didn't look like a genius. He looked like a madman. But as the FBI began to inventory the cabin, they realized the terrifying truth. Ted Kaczynski wasn't crazy because he lacked intelligence. He was dangerous because he had too much of it. He had used his 168 IQ to build a fortress of isolation and a legacy of blood, all from a shack with no running water. The UNABOM was finally in a cage, but his ideas were now out in the world, and the trial that followed would prove to be his final, most public act of war. The final judgment and legacy. The capture of Ted Kaczynski was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a massive legal and psychological battle. In a federal courtroom in California, the man once known as the UNABOM stood before the world. But he didn't look like a revolutionary. He looked like a frail, eccentric scholar trapped in a suit that didn't fit. His defense team, led by some of the best lawyers in the country, faced an impossible task. The evidence found in the cabin, the bombs, the journals, the confession, was overwhelming. Their only hope to save him from the death penalty was to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. But Ted Kaczynski was a man of immense, stubborn pride. To him, being called insane was a fate worse than death. If the world believed he was a madman, then his manifesto, his life's work, would be dismissed as the ramblings of a broken mind. He wanted his murders to be seen as a rational, political act of war against technology. He grew so furious with his own lawyers for trying to save his life through a mental health defense that he attempted to fire them and represent himself. He even attempted suicide in his cell to escape the humiliation of a sanity trial. Ultimately, a deal was struck. To avoid a long, sensational trial and a potential death sentence, Ted pleaded guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was sent to ADX Florence in Colorado, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the most secure supermax prison in the world. Here, in a concrete cell no larger than his Montana cabin, Ted would spend the next quarter-century of his life. In prison, Ted did not fall into silence. He became a prolific writer, corresponding with thousands of people around the globe. He struck up an unlikely friendship with Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, and Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. They were the kings of the supermax, 3 men who had all tried to break America in different ways. Ted also found a strange kind of fame. He received hundreds of letters from admirers, including a schoolteacher who became his lady love through years of written correspondence. As the years passed, the world changed in exactly the ways Ted had predicted. The internet became an inescapable net, artificial intelligence began to outperform human thought, and environmental destruction accelerated. On platforms like TikTok and Reddit, a new generation, depressed by climate change and digital exhaustion, began to rediscover his manifesto. They used the phrase, "Uncle Ted was right," half ironically, half seriously. His ideas survived, even as his crimes remained unforgivable. On June 10, 2023, at the age of 81, Ted Kaczynski was found dead in his cell. He had taken his own life, choosing the time and manner of his exit just as he had chosen his targets for 17 years. He left behind a legacy that is deeply uncomfortable. He was a cold-blooded killer who murdered innocent people, yet he was also a visionary who foresaw the digital cage we now live in. He remains a reminder of what happens when a brilliant mind is broken by isolation and fueled by a hatred that knows no bounds. The cabin is gone, the man is dead, but the questions he raised about our technological future continue to haunt the 21st century. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most complex and chilling criminal minds. If you found this documentary insightful and want to explore more untold stories, psychological profiles, and forgotten chapters of history, make sure to subscribe to our channel.